All right. So welcome to the Praise Neurodiversity Speaker Series panel. Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. What are the symptoms? How does it impact us? What interventions exist? So PRAISE stands for Piedmonters for Resources, Advocacy, and Information in Special Education. PRAISE supports all students by promoting neurodiversity and inclusion in Piedmont schools. We advocate for students with learning differences and disabilities. Our members are parents and supporters of our mission. We are also going through a name change process in the coming months, so please stay tuned. I want to take a moment to thank our co-sponsor, which is the ADHD Parent Circle at Havens, for getting the word out about our event. I want to remind all of you who are joining us today to keep your microphones on mute during this event. If you have any questions, please write them down in the chat, and we're going to do our best to have your questions answered during our Q&A time period. This event is being recorded. If you would like to join our mailing list, please send an email to piedmontpraiseK12@gmail.com. Once again, piedmontpraiseK12@gmail.com. We are joined today by Integrative Pediatrician Dr. Sanford Newmark from the UCSF Osher Center for Integrative Health in San Francisco. Unfortunately, our scheduled panelist, Dr. Kim Thompson, is unable to join us tonight. Dr. Thompson was kind enough to suggest her colleague, Tatiana Guerreiro Ramos, to take her place. Tatiana is an advocate, a consultant, and co-director for Classroom Matters, which provides customized academic support for students and professional development support for educators. Dr. Newmark specializes in integrative and holistic treatment for children with ADHD, autism, and other developmental and chronic childhood conditions. He is the author of ADHD Without Drugs, a guide to the natural care of children with ADHD. Not only is he the medical director of the UCSF Osher Center for Integrative Medicine, but also the head of Neurodevelopmental Pediatrics program. Prior to joining the Osher Center, Dr. Newmark founded the Center for Pediatric Integrative Medicine. He combines conventional medicine with nutrition, behavior management, and complementary modalities. He lectures widely on both ADHD and autism. He has authored portions of an integrative medical textbook, and his online video titled "Do 2.5 million children really need Ritalin?" An integrative approach to ADHD has received over 2.5 million views. And you can add my view to that, Dr. Newmark, as I watched it last night. So Tatiana Ramos is an educational advocate and consultant. As a co-director for Classroom Matters, she works with Bay Area schools to provide customized professional development to teachers and administrators on how to support and engage learners in the classroom. Tatiana works with families to provide support and services for students through the 504 plans and IEP processes. Tatiana has co-created an executive function curriculum for Classroom Matters. She regularly appears as a guest speaker at educational events and as an educator with deep expertise in ADHD and how it shows up at home and at school. Her personal experience with ADHD informs Tatiana's honest and compassionate approach to student and parent coaching. She's a polyglot. I had to actually look that up because I did not know what it was. And it's basically a person who knows and is able to use several languages. And the languages she is fluent in are English, Portuguese, French, and Spanish. She's a 3-time national memory champion. I had to look that up too. And it's basically a competition for thinking games. And that's what Dr. Newmark and Tatiana were talking about before we started. She's the only woman to win the U.S. Memory Ad, I think it's called Memory Ad, in its 25-year history. So welcome, Tatiana, and welcome, Dr. Newmark. And thank you both for joining us this evening.
You're welcome.
So,
pleasure.
So as an opener, Dr. Newmark and Tatiana, I would like to ask you both to lay a foundation for our discussion today. So Dr. Newmark, I'd love you to briefly tell us what ADHD is from a medical standpoint, particularly the 2 or more settings rule. And Tatiana, I would love for you to share with us what ADHD looks like from a behavioral standpoint. And Dr. Newmark, we'll start with you.
Okay, so the definition of ADHD, if you took it right from the DSM-5, which is kind of the manual of is some combination of impulsiveness, attention problems, and hyperactivity, with or without the hyperactivity, so it can be just inattention, that causes an impact both at home and at school. So you have two kinds of ADHD. One is well, there's really three: the hyperactive type, the combined type, and the inattention type. Although I have to say it's very rare to find hyperactive, impulsive kids who don't have inattention. But it's not rare at all to find kids who have inattention and don't have any hyperactivity or impulsivity. So either of the ones that either of those kinds, the definition is still the same. It has to cause an impact both at home and at school, or possibly it's supposed to be two places. So theoretically, it could be school and sports, or home and sports, or something like that. But I pretty much stick to home and school for most kids. So that's a short introduction.
Thank you. Tatiana?
And in terms of behaviors and how ADHD shows up, it really can vary depending on the environment. So what I find is that often parents are bearing the brunt of the behaviors at home, because often our kiddos with ADHD are really working hard to keep themselves together at school, right? They're working hard to conform. They're working hard to learn new things, right? New research is coming out about how ADHD brains are more exhausted than neurotypical brains when they're taking in new material. So typically what I see is that depending on the kid, there will be behaviors showing up at home because the kid comes home and sort of falls apart, right? And what we're seeing at school is less of the sort of disruptive and like crazy behaviors, and more of like off-task behaviors. That's not to say that you won't see disruptive behaviors in school, but just to say that parents are really the ones who students, you know, they're like, well, you're going to be around no matter what, so I'm gonna be my full, you know, ADHD self at home. So it could look like anything from emotional dysregulation, because ADHD is a lot about regulation, right? So it's emotional dysregulation, it's inability to regulate what comes out of their mouths, inability to regulate their attention and focus on things. Often in girls, it's inability to regulate eating. Sometimes there are coexisting conditions, often for girls, eating disorders, anxiety, and some other ways it's showing up is an inability to remember more than one instruction at a time, not being able to follow multi-step directions, forgetting where anything is, clothes all over the place.
That's super helpful. Dr. Newmark,
can I share my screen for a minute? Am I able to do that? Oh, no.
Yeah, I have to make you a host, I believe a co-host to do that. So hang on one second.
I'm not going to give you a slideshow, but there's one important slide I'd like to show everybody, if you can do it. And,
okay.
And while you're doing that, I will say that in addition to what Tatiana says, that one of the most common things I hear from parents are mornings are hell. Right, and getting that distractible and hyperactive child to get up, get their clothes on, and eat breakfast is like monumental as misery every morning. And okay, I'm on co-host now, so let me check. So that's definitely part of it. Okay, let's see. Okay, so I wanted to share this about ADHD because I think it's really important to remember that ADHD symptoms all exist on a continuum. They're not a plus minus. And I think this chart, you can see that some people over here on the chart are very quiet and slow moving, and some people are highly active. Some people are really, really super focused, and some people tend to be distractible. And some people are really, really careful, and some people are impulsive. Now, everything in here is just normal variation in human temperament and personality. And we have to be really careful not to like describe every active person as having ADHD or any impulsive person. Imagine if we had a whole world of quiet, focused, careful people. It would be really, really boring. We wouldn't have any artists. We probably wouldn't have any, have fewer counselors and fewer creative people of all kinds. You know, we don't really want everybody over on that left side of the screen. And so when it becomes ADHD is like what I said before, when it starts having a really negative impact on your life. And we'll talk about this later, but right here, I think there's a risk group who are kind of born here, and then certain environmental factors can throw them over into having ADHD, such as what they eat, for instance. And the other part I wanted to say is ADHD is contextual, meaning it has a lot to do with where the child is in a particular time, what they're doing, and who's looking. You know, for some parents, for some parents, anyway, I'll get rid of that. I'll stop sharing. For some parents, behavior that is completely unsettling and unacceptable is totally normal for other parents. So, and the same thing for teachers. So it's context, both who's looking and where the kids are.
Thank you for that. I'm going to ask you a question, Dr. Guerreiro. It's a bit of a loaded potato because I've seen you answer it in some of the things that you've published, but do you feel that ADHD diagnoses are increasing, or do you feel like ADHD is being misdiagnosed?
Do you mean, do I feel like the actual incidence of ADHD is increasing?
Yes.
Yes and yes. I feel like there's a lot of misdiagnosis, but I also feel like the incidence of ADHD is increasing. And I think part of that is I mean, it's such a complex, there's so many complex reasons why ADHD may be increasing. It has to do with what we eat, the nutritional value, the amount of junk food in our society. It has to do with the breakdown of community structure and the overall anxiety of our society. It has to do with the demands made on kids. I mean, we now diagnose kindergarten kids as having ADHD when they can't sit there and focus for 6 hours a day. Well, who used to have to focus in kindergarten? You know, like it was all eat, sleep, play, you know what I mean? And now 80% of kindergartners teach people to read. You know, it could be good, it could be bad, but it's going to increase the amount of kids with ADHD.
Tatiana?
Yeah, I would also say that what I think the reason why we're seeing kids being diagnosed with ADHD more is because people from my generation who have ADHD, I have ADHD, but I wasn't impacted by it in the same way our kids are being impacted by their ADHD, because I call it working for information. So I had to work for information. I had to go to the card catalog and seek out books. I had to find the Dewey Decimal number and then go find the book in the stacks and find information in the book. And then if I didn't find all of the information I needed in that book, I had to go look for another book. I had to orient myself on a map. I had to go to the bus stop to look at the schedule at the bus stop. I had to make plans with friends ahead of time. I had to show up. All of those tasks, right, that working for information were organic ways of developing executive function, all of those skills that we talk about, which are impacted by ADHD. So I had daily dozens of ways to develop executive function that our kids do not. We're raising the first generation of kids who do not have to work for information. They need opposable thumbs and a screen. And one of the most important executive functions that is developed when you have to work for information is what we call stick-to-itiveness or persistence. So what we're seeing a lot more in our students at Classroom Matters is and I'm sure you've all heard this, what's just too hard? What's too many pages? It's too long. I can't get through it. And that is because they're not being forced to work for information. We had to look through encyclopedias. So I think that one of the reasons why we're seeing a lot more kids being diagnosed is because they are impacted by their neurodivergence in ways that my generation was not.
Thank you for that. Dr. Newmark, what are some of the conditions that are misdiagnosed as ADHD? Can you share with us a little bit? Because there's a lot of that that happens.
Question. The first one, and to me the biggest, especially right now, is anxiety. I think anxiety has always been misdiagnosed, and the problem is that a lot of kids with ADHD have anxiety. So you can have ADHD, you can have anxiety, or you can have both. And it can be really hard to sort those out. And anxiety, I find, is increasing so much in our kids right now. We just have a bunch of really, really anxious kids, and anxious people for that matter. I mean, COVID's a big part of it, and there's probably lots of other parts. A second really big one is learning disabilities. Dyslexia is probably the most common learning disability. So if you have somebody who has dyslexia, things are going to be very hard for them. They're going to really have a hard time learning to read. And they don't, as Tatiana said, stick to it very well. And so they look like they're getting distracted and not interested, and really they just have dyslexia. So that's one you really have to look hard for. And again, dyslexia and ADHD go together a lot. So there's a lot of people who have dyslexia and ADHD. And then there's other things like children who have been have PTSD can look like ADHD. Children who have been exposed to violence, sleep apnea, and then often really, really smart kids, gifted children, can just be so bored in a regular class that they absolutely look like they have ADHD. So, and then kids with a really intense temperament. I think a lot of those kids get misdiagnosed. They don't have ADHD, they just do what they want when they want
to. Does this fall in the category of ODD?
Yeah. I don't like the diagnosis oppositional that defiant disorder too much, because I think it's really overused. It should really be just used for kids who have a long-standing chronic pattern of sort of constant oppositionalness. And I think we have a lot of kids who are just oppositional sometimes and emotionally dysregulated who get diagnosed with that. But yeah, that's another one for sure. Is kids who really have ODD.
Tatiana, what is it that you see?
What is it that I see
in the space of misdiagnosis?
I mean, I would agree with Dr. Newmark. I think it's anxiety and depression. I think often the lack of sleep, sleep deprivation, what happens as a result of sleep deprivation, those symptoms often mimic the same symptoms as ADHD. And as we know, our kids are all sleep deprived. So I think that inability to sustain their attention, I think that's one of the things. Anxiety for sure. And I would agree also about, the dyslexia. Yeah, I think it takes a very skilled practitioner to really parse it out and figure out what's what, right? And figure out, why is this happening? Why is this happening? Because why things are happening will inform how you respond to it.
Yeah, yeah. And to follow up with that, so many of our kids are diagnosed by a primary care doctor with a couple of 15-minute visits. And I'm not criticizing them, because they're working in really difficult circumstances when they're not given the time. You just can't make the diagnosis, a careful diagnosis, and exclude these other things in 15 or 30 minutes. It's not possible.
So what should a careful diagnosis look like from a medical standpoint as well as from an assessment standpoint?
Yeah. So the actual diagnosis of ADHD is almost entirely by history and physical. And it takes a lot of time. You need to ask about the whole child, what his or her relationship to family, community, friends, school is, what the history of that is. You can't just take it. For example, some child who suddenly in 5th grade is not paying attention and is distractible and has had 4 good grades before that. Something is not right? So you really have to go into the history and ask what the parents' history and what their family history is. And usually it takes me, my full workup is 2 hours. Then I get some labs, and we can talk about that maybe later, to talk about some of the nutritional aspects that may affect ADHD significantly. But the actual diagnosis is mostly history. In some kids, you need to go on and get neuropsych testing, which is neuropsychological testing, which is kind of our psychoeducational testing. And that's when you're looking for learning disorders or processing disorders or something besides your sort of basic ADHD. I kind of think in this town, neuropsychological examinations are overdone. Like I have schools who want a neuropsych test for everybody who gets diagnosed with ADHD, which is just absurd. When I'm from Tucson most of my life, and hardly ever anybody got neuropsych testing. So that's the same. But sometimes.
What about you, Tatiana? What are your thoughts?
I mean, I think I agree. I think a good assessment is it takes time, and I think the history is a big part of it. Asking, talking, interviewing the people who are involved in caregiving for that kiddo, because as I think as parents especially, what we find frustrating is just frustrating behavior, because it's they're our kid. So I think it's really important. I mean, at Classroom Matters, we really do take a holistic approach. And I think the same is necessary and required when you're doing an assessment. And I agree that a full neuropsych I think that not every kid needs a full neuropsych. One of the issues I find in my role as an advocate is that often schools, districts will not do the deep digging that they need to do. And so then we, will ask for an independent educational evaluation, which will, normally be a neuropsych, because I like to work with neuropsychs. And so
Can you talk a little bit about, like, for people who are listening who might not know the difference between a neuropsych and like a regular medical evaluation? Can you just briefly define that?
Well, certainly Dr. Newmark can speak more fully to this, but a full neuropsych is as a deep dive into the cognitive the present levels of performance for academics, and also the cognitive skills, so the processing, memory, and it's a snapshot of, based on these testing instruments, of what those cognitive abilities look like in that moment, as opposed to a medical involves more rating scales like the Vanderbilt rating scales and the Basque, and it's more about, rating on a scale, when do these behaviors happen.
Yeah, so a medical,
And that's usually a parental scale or an educator scale. Is that?
Yeah, a medical, so a medical evaluation usually involves history plus, as Tatiana says, the Vanderbilt or Connors, which are these standardized scales that parents and teachers fill out. But they only look at behavior. They don't look at cognitive abilities. So whereas in neuropsych, I mean, most of them you will get IQ testing, achievement testing, auditory processing, visual spatial processing, memory evaluations, attention evaluations, and then other thoughts that they come across while working with the kid, whether they find anxiety or depression. They might do some anxiety or depression scales. Usually it's like about a 40-45 page report, which nobody ever reads, and about 3/4 of the time the parents don't have any idea what it said, except, oh, my kid has ADHD. But, so that's why I'm a little skeptical about their use. And also, it's really funny sometimes when they do these sort of tests of attention, if sometimes the child has attention issues, but the tests of attention don't come out positive. So they say, oh, well, he has ADHD anyway. But if the attention tests come out positive, but the child doesn't really have the symptoms, then they say, oh, well, he has ADHD anyway. Because they really want to make the diagnosis for that $6,000 so that the kid can get school services.
Good point. Excellent
It
point
sounds
there.
like skeptical, but
Yeah.
there's a certain amount of truth to it.
Yeah. So I want to change directions for a second. That many times we think when when someone says, "Oh, this person, that looks like ADHD," usually people think of a young boy bouncing off the walls, and they're looking for impulsivity and hyperactivity. But a lot of times, inattention gets overlooked. So and many times misdiagnosed. So what should parents and educators be looking out for when hyperactivity and impulsivity is not present?
So the first thing you're going to look for is signs of a short attention span and distractibility. And you'll see those probably at school, where the teacher will say, they're dreaming, they're not listening, they need to be told three times. And then a lot of times you're not learning what they should be. They're falling behind because they can't pay attention. They're just sort of in their own world. Then at home, it'll be the same kind of thing. You tell them to go get their shoes on, and you find them reading a book in their room, and it's not because they're being oppositional. It's because they just forgot that they're supposed to get their shoes on, or go feed the dog, or whatever else it is. They happily go off to do what they're supposed to be doing, and then they get distracted. And that's why for the inattention type things, learning can be so difficult, because if you got 3 kids to get off to school, you can't get this one kid ready. It's really, really frustrating. So that's the kind of thing you look for. And you have to really distinguish it from the oppositional kid who just, doesn't feel like doing it. But it's not that hard. Parents usually have a sense. And kids are often very apologetic about it. I mean, I think the classic one is the sweet little girl who's off in their own worlds for most of the time and dreaming. A lot of times they can pay attention to things like sports or dance or whatever, but when it comes to school, they just can't do it.
Yeah, and I would also add that that piece about giving up easily.
Oh yeah.
Right? When you're when you see a kid who can't, when you're getting feedback from the teacher that your kiddo just needs to work harder or just needs to apply themselves, that's, to me, is often a sign of, okay, my kid is struggling to engage, and so why is my kid struggling to engage? And at home it often looks like that giving up when things are challenging, and also the working memory is often impacted by ADHD, and that's the ability to hold smaller pieces of information. And so when you tell your kid to take the trash out, and when they come in, empty the dishwasher, and then go switch their lawn. I mean, how many of us, my kids with ADHD, like, I can't tell you, I've had loads of laundry that they've had to redo like 7 times because they forget that it's in the washing machine. So that piece, when they can only do the first thing that you told them to do, and everything else after that is sort of gone. So those are the sorts of things that I would look for too.
Yeah, I'm glad you are bringing up that stick-to-itiveness thing, because I don't usually think of it that way, but I hear about it so much. It's and this is with inattention or impulsive hyperactive, that a lot of these kids, if it gets hard, they just kind of give up. Even if it's a little hard, they give up. And I've always thought of it as just sort of a history of failure. When everything is hard for you and you're getting negative feedback all the time, you just kind of give up more easily. But maybe it's more than that. Maybe it's actual brain function and not being able to persist.
Yeah, and especially when kids are for things that are not interesting, because boredom is kryptonite for the ADHD brain. So when they're giving up easily, especially on we've seen kids with ADHD who can hyper focus, who can hyper focus on the things that are most interesting to them, they're like getting 50% on a math test because they weren't paying attention to the details and didn't see that they had to multiply instead of divide, or add instead of subtract. But there's like a Lego factory going on in your house that NASA is calling about, so it's that that the challenge to stay to regulate your attention on challenging things. So I would say, because often parents will say to me, well, but they can pay attention all day to a video game, and I'm like, yeah, because that's interesting and it's feeding the dopamine need, they're chasing the dopamine. So yeah, of course they can focus on that. It's on the harder things that I find that gives me more information.
I want to take us down to the world of integrative health, Dr. Newmark, for a second, because you wrote the book, ADHD Without Medication. So let's talk nutrition, supplements, that world. What can we do? What can parents do aside from medication? Or what should they be thinking about?
There's really a large number of things that parents can do. And I don't want to make this a medication versus non-medication issue. I like to start with non-pharmaceutical approaches, but I have a lot of kids in my practice who do take medication. So starting right from the beginning, okay, you make the diagnosis, you make sure it's a right diagnosis, and then you start looking at what they eat. It's very clear that the quality of diet can really affect ADHD. For instance, artificial colors and flavors actually make everybody more inattentive and hyperactive. In Europe, there's a warning label on any product that is artificial colors and flavors. And then processed foods with low amounts of fiber and high amounts of processed carbs are sort of just like sugar, because they get digested very, very quickly and turn into sugar in your bloodstream. So there's a lot of studies that kids who have, this has to do with the glycemic index, which has to do with how fast or slow you digest carbs get turned into sugar. So are really good, for instance, whole grain bread with lots of seeds and stuff, and it'll be lower on the glycemic index, but it'll be more slowly turned into sugar. Whereas a piece of white bread or a waffle or a pancake will be very quickly turned into sugar. And your body doesn't like that. The blood sugar goes up quickly and your body doesn't like that. So it produces a bunch of insulin and takes it down below normal, and then you have what looks like more irritability and less ability to focus. So breakfast is really a big one to me. If you think about waffles, like frozen waffles, frozen pancakes, which are a very popular breakfast, mostly eaten with syrup or jelly or honey or something, that's almost like giving pure sugar to a kid for breakfast, because it gets waffles, pancakes, the flour is so beat, so highly processed in order to make it light that it's digested very, very quickly. So I really recommend something with a good amount of protein, a good amount of fiber for breakfast, like eggs, like good whole grain toast with peanut butter, like oatmeal, like even a really good cold cereal is okay, but how many people are giving their kids, Lucky Charms and things like that, which have the same problem as waffle? Usually a little better if they're given with milk. So, and then I could go on forever. Quality of the diet is important. Pesticides in food actually make ADHD worse. And there's studies showing that giving kids who have ADHD have way more pesticides in their bladder, in their urine, than kids who don't have ADHD. And that's probably where that graph I showed you about risk factors comes into play. Because the kids who are over on the left side who probably can eat pesticides and not have ADHD symptoms, but the kids who are in that risk group, if they get too many pesticides, they probably get thrown over into ADHD. And then some kids are sensitive to certain foods like gluten or dairy or corn or soy. And just by removing them from the diet, you can actually change symptoms dramatically. There's several studies about that out in the literature. There's more, but I'll stop if we've been talking for the next hour. But that's just the nutrition part of it. I'll tell you more after other people get a chance to talk or ask questions.
Yeah, and I would just add that, often kids with ADHD and adults with ADHD, by the way, we sometimes forget to eat.
Yeah.
Kids with ADHD either forget to eat, or sometimes the medication has an impact on their appetite. And so they are super impacted by the low blood sugar, by being hungry. So it turns into hangry, right? And because ADHD is a regulation, right? It impacts regulation of all the things. When they're hangry, they are not regulated. And so often, my kid is behaving like an unleashed dragon, and I'll be like, honey, can I make you a snack? Can I make you, can I give you something to eat? And, I talk to my kids all the time about how their brains work and how we're differently wired. And so they're aware enough now where they're, even if they're raging, they're like, yeah, please make me a snack, and so I'll make them something. And, 20 minutes later, they're like, thank you so much for feeding me. So I think it's super complicated and it's super challenging, the nutrition piece, because sometimes when your kid is hangry, you just want to shove a Cliff Bar or something in their face just to get them a little bit more regulated, when some string cheese might have been a little bit better. But the other thing too is that the other often coexisting challenge for kids with ADHD are sensory processing issues, or sensory integration, or things like misophonia, which is sensitivity to certain sounds. So often kiddos with ADHD are super picky eaters. So it's very, that piece is very, it's been super challenging in my household. I will say that.
Oh, yeah, I agree. It runs the gamut. I have kids in my practice with ADHD with absolutely no pickiness. They'll eat anything thrown in front of them, and then some of them are really picky. The other thing that is one of my pet peeves is schools now have this thing where the kids go to eat lunch, and as soon as they're done with lunch, they can run out and play at recess. Now, how many kids are going to sit around and take the time to eat their lunch in a reasonable way when they can be out playing? This is not how it used to be. It used to be there was a lunchtime, and no matter how fast or slow you ate your lunch, you didn't get to go out until they rang the bell. So why schools have done this is beyond me, but it's really led to a lot of kids not eating their lunch or taking just a few bites, which for most kids it's all right, it's not that terrible. But for the ADHD kid who gets angry or who loses focus when they get low sugar, that's really bad. So
Can we take this moment right now, this little opening, to talk about supplements, Dr. Newmark, like zinc, or I know you're a big omega-3 fan. There's an issue with magnesium, ferritin. If you can touch on that, that would be great.
Yeah. So there are several supplements that there's really good research on for ADHD, and the order of the amount of research. The first one is fish oil. Fish oil supplies omega-3 fatty acids, which are extremely important for normal brain function. And there's many studies showing that, number one, kids with ADHD are unusually low in omega-3 fatty acid content. And number two, they get better when you give them fish oil. So as a general rule, I just give every kid with ADHD fish oil. Lately, Quest has developed a test that you can order and insurance will pay for, that you can measure omega-3 levels. And I've been doing that, but it's more out of curiosity than anything else, because every kid I test doesn't take omega-3s, it's low. And everyone I test who does take omega-3s, it's fine. So it's like, eventually I probably can stop. But anyway, that's fish oil. Number two is a much less well-known one is an iron. And what you measure for iron is called ferritin. Ferritin is the amount of iron you have in storage, which regulates the amount of iron you can get to your brain. And ferritin, or iron, is very important for brain function. And there's a number of studies showing that kids with ADHD should have a ferritin over 30. And most of the kids I test don't. And nobody ever tests their ferritin. A lot of times kids get blood tests for anemia. But that just shows the amount of iron in your red blood cells. And most of these kids, even with really low ferritin, are not anemic. So ferritin is one of the things I check in every kid. Zinc can be really low, and that directly affects ADHD. And you would think, well, why should zinc be low in these kids? Or why ferritin, for that matter? We don't really know. But one thing we do know is there's like half as much zinc in agricultural products now as there was a couple of generations ago, because of the quality of the land and how we raise food and all those kind of things. And then vitamin D has information about less, but some information. And I always check vitamin D, because unbelievable number of kids are insufficient for vitamin D. It's amazing, because our kids aren't spending a lot of time outside, especially in the Bay Area, because it's foggy a lot and it's cold a lot, and kids aren't running around in shorts and a t-shirt all that often. And then magnesium, as you say, I don't usually check it anymore because they're almost always normal levels, but it actually can be a really helpful supplement to give kids to help them calm down and relax, like before bed. Or a little known thing is some kids have rebound when when the medication they're taking wears off. Maybe Tatiana has had a kid with that, I don't know, but like, they take Concerta or something and they're great until about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and then they're horrible, but worse than they were if they didn't take it, because it's just kind of a rebound. And magnesium could be really helpful right there to sort of calm them down as it wears off. And then the other supplements I use are herbal or botanical ones. And I use ginkgo, or lately I've been using this one called bacopa, which is an Ayurvedic herb, which has been shown to be helpful in cognitive function. So that's sort of my basic supplement roundup.
Wonderful. And how does one ask for this type of testing? Your average pediatrician is not going to do a ferritin test as easily. So what are some suggestions?
I mean, I find that most pediatricians will do it if somebody asks. And actually I'm seeing, maybe it's because I've been yammering about it for so long, but I've actually seen more kids come to me who've had their ferritin tested.
Nice.
But, I think for parents who haven't got it tested, just go, I read this, there's research about it, please check their ferritin, zinc, and vitamin D. I mean, it's not that hard. The only people who it's hard for is people who are in HMO like Kaiser, because they're just all over which labs they order.
Yeah.
Kaiser is all over which labs their pediatricians order.
Fantastic. Are there any outside labs you can go to in case your doctor will not do the test or Kaiser will not do the test?
Yeah, well, you have to get somebody to order it no matter where you go. Yeah, nobody, but you can just, no, you can't. I mean, I don't know of any labs that'll do it if you don't have an order,
Good to know. Good to know. So find the doctor, find the doctor, basically. Okay, fantastic. Okay, switch gears for a second, Tatiana. Now you have a child with ADHD, or you suspect you have a child with ADHD, you're in the process of getting all the things you need in order. What are some supports and accommodations that can be provided in a school setting? What are things that parents don't know about that can be done? I know you and I briefly chatted about that on a call today. So if you want to share that, that'd be amazing.
Yeah, I mean, so many. I mean, I think, again, because our kids are not getting the same opportunities for developing executive function organically that we were. I think even neurotypical kids who don't have any learning differences, who don't have any learning disabilities, are also impacted by underdeveloped executive function. So I personally think that we should be explicitly teaching these skills and tools and strategies starting in elementary school. But specifically for kids with ADHD, one of the most impactful accommodations that I've seen my students and my own kids benefit from is teacher notes and graphic organizers. So in other words, it's often very hard for a kiddo with ADHD to do two cognitively demanding things at once, which is what teachers are often asking them to do. So they're asking them to listen to a lecture, right? Process that information, and then turn that information into meaningful notes that they then understand later. And doing those two cognitively demanding tasks at once is often very hard for students. So I often will ask for that to be included for my clients. Also, open note tests. This notion somehow that our students are supposed to know everything all the time, especially for subjects that are not particularly interesting to them, that maybe they won't be using in the rest of their lives. Like, the goal should be mastery and learning information, right? And the more students interact with the material, the better the chances that they'll encode that material. So I ask for open note testing. Graphic organizers, so helping. So And also chunking out instructions. So I often see, for my kids, I email the teachers every year, hey, my kid has ADHD. Do you know how to scaffold ADHD in the classroom? And of course, invariably, the answer is no. And so then I offer to help adapt instruction. So kids with ADHD are often very overwhelmed by a lot of information on one page. So I tell teachers that they have to break out the instructions. So often they will have like a paragraph, right? A very dense paragraph of instructions. And I'll say, my kids stopped reading at the first sentence. So I want you to put this in a bullet form with little check boxes next to it so that my kid can use that as a checklist. Or else, and the other really impactful accommodation is to have prompts, rubrics, instructions directly in the Google Doc that the student is working in, so that the student doesn't have to toggle back and forth between rubrics and instructions and prompts. And so for my students, I will often just put everything up at the top of the page, and I'll say, okay, well, let's put a line through. Okay, we did the thesis, we did the body paragraph. So really that kind of deep scaffolding to lessen the burden on working memory, and to reduce the number of steps it takes. So that's the goal, right? Is to just make sure that you're reducing the number of steps involved in completing assignments and that you're reducing the burden on working memory.
Excellent. Tatiana,
I have a
can
few
you
others,
also,
if
oh,
you don't mind
go
my
ahead.
interrupting, just some really simple ones that I know Tatiana does too. It's like extra time on tests can be really helpful. A quiet place to take tests can be helpful. Not getting penalized for turning in things late, because they all do, a lot of them just do their homework and then it gets lost in the morass of their backpack. And I really like the part about open note tests. We are entering an era where all information is available to anybody all the time. So it is no longer a life skill to be able to remember information as your number one thing. It's how to find information and that's relevant in a reasonable amount of time that's important, because it's all there with a click of the mouse.
And
So,
if the students' notes aren't effective, then they're not going to be useful on a test. So that's what I say to teachers. Yeah. The extra time, I will say, I'm very selective about that, because it depends on what kinds of supports and scaffolding the kid has in the classroom, and if they have an advisory period, because sometimes the extra time will just mean that everything gets backed up until the very last minute. So I sometimes.
I didn't mean extra time to take the test, but like while they're taking the test.
Yeah, no, I meant because sometimes parents are like, oh, my kid just needs time and a half for homework. I'm like, no. No. Your kid needs extra time on tests. Your kid does not need extra time to like procrastinate.
Right.
So, yeah.
Tatiana, can you briefly define what a 504 is, what an IEP is, and when you ask for which one?
So a 504 plan, they fall under two different laws. The 504 plan falls under the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and an IEP falls under a separate law altogether called the IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. A 504 plan is a legal document put into place to basically level the playing field and ensure that your kid is not being discriminated against in school because of a disability. An IEP plan has goals and objectives that the district is then required to provide supports and services in furtherance of those goals and objectives. So An IEP generally has more teeth because there are more procedural safeguards associated with an IEP. A 504 plan, there's no legally mandated timeline. There's no legally mandated review or annual check-in. An IEP has a lot more safeguards. Generally speaking, in most cases, a 504 plan is more accommodations. So accommodations or modifications to the curriculum, or accommodations for the disability, whereas an IEP, again, has services. You can have services in a 504 plan, but generally they're for accommodations.
In my experience, most kids with just ADHD and no learning disabilities or other issues have a fairly hard time getting an IEP, where it's relatively easy to get a 504, but it's not 100%.
I mean, depending on the school district, it's, I work with a lot of different school districts, and depending on which one, a lot of them know me. And depending on which school district, some people are super happy to have me in IEP meetings, and some people are not. So yeah, it's not, there's a lot that you should know before going into these meetings, and because districts are not very good at explaining what your rights are in plain language.
Okay, great. I'm going to turn to the chat because some of the questions are coming in. What does one do about procrastination? How much should a parent be involved in dealing with or preventing the aftermath? Either of you can answer that.
So repeat the question, please.
What do you do about procrastination? How much should a parent be involved in dealing with or preventing the aftermath? That's the question. In a related piece to that, it would be nice if you guys can just talk about how to deal with frustrated parents overall, who feel overwhelmed. Because I know Dr. Newmark has some thoughts on that as well. So either of you can take that.
I'll let Tatiana start with the procrastination thing because I'm interested in what she's going to say. I'll talk a little bit about frustrated parents. She can too, I'm sure.
Yeah, so the procrastination piece is super real, and I will just say that the struggle is very real. And we take we use a model, it's a teaching model called the gradual release model. It's I do, we do, you do. And your student is going to be stuck in the I do and we do portion of that for much longer than you are comfortable with. And often kids with ADHD learn the hard way, and have to learn by experiencing what the consequences are. So we encourage parents to offload as much of the academic support piece as possible, either to a sibling or another trusted adult, a tutor, whoever it might be. The truth is that kids with ADHD lag in their executive function even more than neurotypical people do, right? So a fully developed frontal lobe happens around 25 in neurotypical brains. For kids with ADHD, it's closer to 30. So
can you define briefly what executive function is for people who do not know what that is?
Yeah, so the executive functions for our purposes are the skills that enable students and adults to engage in goal-directed behavior. So things like planning and prioritizing, organizing everything. Often people with ADHD are time blind. So being able to estimate how long things will take, and then being able to take that knowledge and put on their future glasses and say, okay, it's going to take me 7 hours to complete this project. So I'm going to chunk it out into 30-minute pieces between now and the end of the month, right? Kids with ADHD can't even find their future glasses, never mind put them on, right? So those are the executive functions. They're the how of having a successful and productive life.
Excellent.
And also the metacognitive piece, I will say, is super important. And by that I mean understanding what you need to be successful, what you need to learn, and what you need to engage as a happy human being, right? Like, I need time to process. So I need you to leave me alone for a little bit. I need time, so that metacognitive piece is really important.
Dr. Newmark, were you going to say something?
I was going to add that I actually think this thing about procrastination is, people look at it only from one side of it. I mean, most people procrastinate to start with. I doubt if I've ever finished a lecture that I was supposed to give before the night before. In college, I never finished a paper before the night before. Lots of people procrastinate, and I even heard a really interesting TED talk by a really good scientist that said that he thought procrastination was part of, in his case, was the brain kind of working on things for a while before doing them. And the idea that kids are supposed to get this project that's due in a month and, like, each week, set out 2 hours to work on this project, like, that's not going to happen in the vast majority of kids. So one thing I tell parents is, it's a matter of degree. If they procrastinate so much they can't possibly get it done, that's bad. But a certain degree of procrastination is entirely normal. I really think. To answer your second question about frazzled, frustrated parents, I work with that a lot, and it clearly depends on the case and the parent. But I find that it's the kids who have the hyperactive type of ADHD or hyperactive impulsive, who are also kind of oppositional, that really drive parents the most crazy. And they get into this, so they're raising their kids. Maybe they've had 2 kids before this kid, or maybe their friends are all raising kids in just a sort of normal parenting way. And it's not working. Their kids are difficult, like all the other parents are looking at them like, what's the matter with you? And they get frustrated and angry. And then a lot of times they end up like either yelling at their kids and reacting with big temper, or just letting them get away with everything, right? So the kid can totally take advantage of this as well. So I think these parents with difficult kids really need help. And I think some type of solid parenting approach with mental health, guidance is really important. I happen to love something called the nurtured heart approach. I've used it for 15 years, and almost all the families I use it with who actually put it into place find it to be very, very helpful. But it's just one, there's all kinds of but you have to give parents a scaffolding, something that this is what you need to do, and this is why you need to do it, and maybe somebody to help them with it. In the nurtured heart approach, we have trainers who actually work directly with parents. So that's one thing that's good. But like UCSF has something called the HALP program, HALP, for kids with ADHD. But parents really need help.
Yeah, I say one more thing two more things. One, because I do a lot of parent coaching, is I tell parents all the time that, because I'm super transparent and very, honest, if you can't emotionally regulate, then you have no business asking your kid to emotionally regulate, right? Because your kid is going to copy everything you're doing. And if you can't regulate yourself, then it's not a reasonable expectation that your kid will, because you have a fully developed frontal cortex, prefrontal cortex. You have a fully developed.
Hopefully.
Right, right. And so if you can't regulate yourself, you have no business asking your kid to regulate themselves. And the other thing I tell parents is the learning will come. You have to connect before you correct. If you are not connecting with your kid, you are not, the correction piece is not going to be well received. Your kid is not going to listen to you. So if you're not correcting, if you're not connecting first, you're not going to be able to correct.
That's really great. I love that phrase, connect first. I mean, in the nurture heart approach and other approaches, what you're trying to do is reward the kid and for any really good positive behavior with your attention, with your intensity. So they want to get your approval and your attention, and so they keep doing more things like that, whereas most kids get their attention when they do something wrong. You know, I often use the example of Johnny's playing quietly with his sister. What does mom do? Mom gets a cup of coffee, does the dishes, whatever, makes a phone call. And then when he hits the sister over the head and they come crying, she's screaming at Johnny, right? So what does Johnny learn? Like, when do I get my mom's attention and intensity? When I do something wrong. Now, that's not conscious necessarily. So in that approach, if Johnny's playing well with his sister, you just walk in there really briefly and go, wow, great to see you guys playing so well together. And then you go get your cup of coffee. They're just really noticing the good things they do instead of just only reacting to what they do wrong.
All right. I want to make sure we get these questions answered. One of the questions is your panelist stated that she speaks to her children about their ADD. At what age did those conversations begin, and what did they consist of? So Tatiana, that one's for you.
I mean, as soon as we started noticing anything. So I'm a single mom, and it's so I mean, as soon as possible. I believe in transparency. So when my youngest started feeling like, she was getting frustrated, right? Why can't I fill in the blank? And I said, well, I have ADHD and it's genetic, and both your brothers have it. She's my youngest. Both your brothers have it. There's a good chance that you have it. So, and this is what it looks like, right? And to frame it in a way that helps them see that their brain is differently wired. Doesn't mean there's anything wrong with them. It just means that they're differently wired. Your brain is differently wired. And so when one kid needs this thing at school or at home, you're going to need this other thing, right? You need things written down. You need multiple reminders. You need multiple prompts. As a result, right, my 16-year-old can now be like, I'm frustrated and I feel myself getting worked up and emotionally dysregulated. And so I need to take a minute. I think I might be hungry, right? So I'm talking to them all the time. What does this look like? Well, it looks like you might be a little, you're going to sometimes be dysregulated. Sometimes your brain is going to explode all over the place. And by the way, my brain still explodes every once in a while, right? All over my children. And then I have to go and apologize, right? Because that repair is super important too. Mm-hmm. So just helping them frame it as a way that they are different. You're different. Your brain works differently. And it's going to look different in every kid.
And one thing to add is 1 out of every 6 kids, even when they're not, or 1 out of every 10 kids, let's say, is diagnosed with ADHD. This is not rare. It's not like you have a very rare difference in your brain.
Yeah. Yeah.
Another person wrote, why is behavior so difficult in the morning and what can you do about it?
Well, I think to me, there's just a lot of demands in a short period of time for somebody who can't pay attention. Forgetting about some of these kids are on meds and their meds haven't taken effect in the morning, but even without that, I mean, there's a lot of things to do in a very short period of time usually. And, people, kids, would rather just hang out for a while, especially kids with ADHD, kind of get themselves together. And then it's, get up, get your clothes on, take your shower, brush your teeth, and come down and have breakfast and get your backpack together. And it's a lot of stuff. There's lots of things to do about it. One is to get the kid to bed early and give them a little more time in the morning. Another is various kinds of reminders or rewards. I'll let Tatiana talk more about that, though.
Yeah, I mean, we have, checklists, right? Until using the time timer so I have this time timer. I use it with my students too, but, using the time timer to so I'm like, okay, well, now you've got, 40 minutes. So this helps my kids be aware of the passage of time, right? So it helps develop that awareness of, estimating time. And then also it takes the burden off of the parent of being like, you've got 20 minutes, you've got 10 minutes, you've got 15 minutes. You just have the time timer there to be like, and you just, a lot of ADHD parenting is Groundhog Day, right? It's just saying and doing the same things over and over and over again. And I tell parents, the more you just accept that you're going to be repeating yourself, because I have parents who are like, I had this conversation with my kid. I'm like,
The best thing I ever heard is like some mom said to me, it's like this morning has never happened before, every morning.
And that's just, and your kid already feels bad about themselves. And so what you need to do is help them not feel bad about themselves. And so checklists, right? So after doing this, right, for 2 years, my 6th grader now gets out of the house on time by herself. Now, is it graceful? Do we always nail the dismount? No, not at all. This morning was a poo show. It was a poo show. And there were behaviors that were going on that were just the extra special sauce for me. And so I said, I have to go because I have to get to my exercise class because I need to practice self-care. That's another thing that I say to my kids all the time. I need to practice some self-care. I need to get to my class. I see that you're getting dysregulated. I trust you to figure out the shoe situation. And she did. And she got herself out of the house on time. So I would just say, like, the more you can scaffold them in the mornings, right? Make things so that they don't have to think so hard about everything, right? Pick the clothes out the night before, right?
I have a bunch of parents who have their kids sleep in their clothes the night before.
Why not?
If it works. All right, 2 questions. 1, what if your child has sensory issues, limited food preferences? Is the processed food might be the only thing he eats? Or he or she eats? What do you do? Number 2, should parents limit after-school activities for their ADD child because they worry about overstimulation versus regulation?
I'll take my opinion on those first. The second question first is, I think kids shouldn't be overscheduled. On the other hand, if their after-school activities are the things they're good at and they're fun, you don't want to over limit that because they're spending all day doing something they're not good at, and that's not fun. So I think it's really, really important for ADHD kids to do things that play to their strengths as much as possible. So I don't think they'll get dysregulated when they're doing stuff that really plays to their strengths. So of course, that doesn't mean they play 3 sports and have violin and piano lessons in the same week, but I think that's really important. I never like have them stop playing sports or dancing or whatever because they're not doing well in school. That's just adding insult to injury. And then about the food prep thing, the best thing I ever heard is there's somebody named Ellen Satir, who's probably the most famous feeding therapist in the country. And what she says is, your job as a parent is to offer your children the food you want them to eat when you want them to eat it. And their job is to decide whether to eat it or not. So if you have a child who only wants to eat processed foods, you're going to stop offering them processed foods or processing foods all the time, and they'll either eat or they won't. And as a general rule, they will eat. I've never seen an ADHD kid who completely stopped eating because he or she didn't get what they wanted. I've seen that in a few autistic kids. I mean, some of those kids can literally just stop eating for days. I mean, it doesn't mean you need to do it all at once, but I don't think oh, my child will only eat waffles for breakfast is a good excuse. I mean, you have to like change it, maybe gradually, maybe offer them a few different breakfast things that are good, but you stop offering the waffles, but snacks or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that about, sometimes our kids struggle with intrinsic motivation, meaning that they can't motivate themselves, and so sometimes they need extrinsic motivation. And so with my middle kid, for example, who was just I literally I wanted to shove spoons in my eyes sometimes because it was so hard to get him to eat anything. And so I bribed him with rewards, right? And that's how I got him to try new things. And now he's 16 and he's on the football team, which was very hard for me. I was like, let me be super clear. You are never playing football. And then it was like the thing that he found that he loved. And so now he's a starting wide receiver on the varsity football team. I will say the exercise thing is, science shows that exercise is the #1 replenisher of the self-regulation tank. You want a self-regulated kid, run them, right? So sometimes I say to parents, who gives the best parenting advice is Caesar the dog whisperer. Exercise, discipline, affection, in that order. That's often how I operate, right? I'm like, do you need to go exercise? Please go outside and run. And we do this with our students sometimes, right? Too. Our students who are like, they can't focus, they can't attend. And so we make them run to the end of the block and back, and we time them. So exercise is super important. My kiddo, the football season just ended, and he literally came home on the first day. There was no practice. I mean, this is a kid who leaves the house at 8 o'clock in the morning, right? And isn't back until 8:30 or 9 at night. And the first day after they had turned their equipment back in, and he was literally wandering around the hallway, and I was like, are you okay? And he's like, I don't know what to do with myself. And so we had to figure out some other things, but he noticed, right, that without that hard workout every day after school, he was feeling depressed, unmotivated.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up. I always ask about exercise. I think it's crucial for every kid. And a problem is that many kids with ADHD are good athletes, but there's many kids with ADHD who are just klutzy. And they're not going to make or be good at any team sports, but still they need to exercise. So sometimes they do a lot better with individual sports when there's not that much to keep track of, tennis, swimming, those kind of things.
Mhm.
And often they're really good at martial arts. I don't know what that's about, but martial arts are really great for kids with ADHD. And sometimes for especially the older kids who just don't want to go out and do anything, I'll have the parents get them on a treadmill in the house or an exercise bike and say, you want your screen time? Do it on the treadmill or you're not getting it. That works.
Yeah, or even a mini trampoline
Yeah.
or a balance board. There's new research showing that that balancing exercises
Oh.
is actually addressing some of the symptoms of ADHD. And I think it has to do with the vestibular system, right? Because we're often like, we don't know where our bodies are in space. So I have a balance board in my house. I have a medicine ball. I have one of those Bosu. It's like a half medicine ball. I have a mini trampoline. Basically, like anything that gets my kids moving.
So we're almost at time. What are the benefits of having ADHD? What are the things that we can celebrate about our kids, people that we know in our life who have ADHD? I can name one thing, a Memroid champion.
No, I think there's a lot of things. ADHD people are often great entrepreneurs. The successful entrepreneurs very often have ADHD because they have imagination, they have a lot of energy, they don't get stuck in patterns. Many people with ADHD are very artistic and creative in one way or another. They make super salesmen sometimes. They often are very good socially and interpersonally. So there's a lot of strengths that they can have. There's a great book by the guy who started Kinko's, which was this copying place which he started in a one room, the size of a bedroom. And he ended up selling this empire to FedEx for $380 billion or something. And he had such bad ADHD he couldn't even get out of school, go to college. And he thought it was a big advantage for him because he was out talking to people, moving around and figuring out what was going on in the stores instead of sitting behind the desk. And the book is called Copy This. It's really interesting.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, I mean, I think, in all of my consulting with parents and with kids, I will often say to them, ask them what their ADHD superpower is. And then I'll say, I know that it probably doesn't yet feel like a superpower, but it will eventually. I think kids and adults with ADHD often think outside the box. So the solutions we come up with are often very different. The way we come at things, I think our creativity, our ability to shift and the, getting along with all sorts of different people. And I think also a lot of kids with ADHD have deep reserves of compassion and empathy, which is amazing. And, that ability to relate to other people is amazing.
Fabulous. I want to take just a minute now for Laura Mistrelli, who is part of the ADHD Parent Circle at Havens, to just tell the group how to reach out to her for joining this wonderful group.
Hi, everyone. First, I want to say thank you to Praise for organizing this panel. I learned so much, and thank you to our two amazing panelists. I have there's notes all over the place. I ran out of paper and I didn't want to get up and miss anything. So thank you both so much. It was really, really helpful. As Firas mentioned, I started the ADHD Parent Circle at Havens. For those of you who aren't familiar with the restorative justice circles that we run at Havens, they're basically modeled on a very structured format, and we have them for all different kinds of affinity groups and for grade levels. And I decided I got trained in being a circle keeper because I really felt like we needed a space for families who are dealing with ADHD to talk to each other and support each other and not try to solve all the problems of the world, but really just be there for each other, because it can feel very alienating, as I'm sure many of you know. I found this talk very validating, because so much of what, especially Tatiana, is someone who's experienced it herself and has parented children with ADHD. It just feels good to know you're not the only crazy parent screaming at your kids. So if you're interested in joining a Haven Circle, we have another one planned for January. It's always in Haven's highlights. And if you're at one of the other elementary schools or at the middle school or the high school and are interested in creating some kind of circle experience, let me know. Maybe Fairuz can put my email address in the chat, and I can help you sort of learn more about how to get trained as a circle keeper. But they're really wonderful, safe spaces. We are very, very respectful of privacy, and everything that's discussed there stays at the circle. But it's a really good way to build community around this challenging but often inspiring kind of children that we're raising. So thank you. And thank you again, everyone.
Thank you, Laura. Any last minute things that either Tatiana or Dr. Newmark you want to close with, things you want everyone to take away that maybe wasn't said today?
Well, I think for me, I just want to say that I have learned more from parenting my neurodivergent kids. And I have become a better person because of it. And so I really encourage you to think of this as an opportunity for growth as a person and as a parent, and just to remind parents that this time is fleeting, right? These years that we have with our kids in our home, they're very short. And so think about what it is, what you want your kid to have as their core memories, because the world is very hard. It's very hard. It's a constant struggle. And so what do you want your kids to have as their core memories?
Excellent. Dr. Newmark?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to end. I would just take off on that and say, just remember school, especially in the first, 6 to 8, first 6 to 8 grades, it's not everything, and a lot of kids get better just naturally as they get older. And, have fun with your kids and enjoy the things they're good at, and let them do the things they're good at, and, they'll get through.
Thank you. I just dropped a bunch of information in the chat. Everyone on this call must absolutely watch Dr. Newmark's YouTube talk on this topic. He goes into a lot of details. The book goes even more details. I highly suggest that you take a moment to read it. It's a lot of information that's going to be incredibly helpful to all of you. And I want to give a big thank you, Tatiana and Dr. Newmark, to both of you for taking time out of your evening. I can tell, Dr. Newmark, you're in your office, so it's been an awfully long day for you. So thank you both so much.
This is my house. I just put up a...
Oh, no. Okay, good to know, because I feel like I've seen that scene at some point before when I spoke with you. So thank you both so much for joining us today and being with us today. We really appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.